So I'm not an ARPG player, but even to me, Path of Exile 2 is looking absolutely amazing. And in this video, I just wanted to go over why that is, and maybe what the difference is to usual ARPGs. As you can see here, I have around 477.9 hours of Path of Exile 1 and around 275 hours of Last Epoch, which both of that is not a whole lot, to be honest. But I always liked ARPGs, but they could never hook me long term. And there's two reasons for that. Reason number one is usually gameplay. I'm usually someone who plays games that have really nice, fluid, visceral action combat, so something like Lost Ark or Black Desert Online. I think ARPGs have been struggling with finding a proper combat identity even. I think most ARPGs, well, at least the ones that I've played, end up being just you spam 1 or 2 buttons maybe, and that's basically your entire build. So, but I do think that is actually really boring. I actually really dislike that about ARPGs. That's probably the main reason why I hated re-leveling, right? Like, there's so much discussion about ARPGs not having acts anymore, and you just, you know, once your first character goes through the story once, you don't have to do it. I think the problem with that is not actually the story so much, but it's actually the gameplay being kind of boring. So even if you do play another build, it just ends up being you clicking 1 or 2 buttons again, although they look different. Path of Exile is trying to change that for the first time I've ever seen an ARPG trying to do it anyways. The obvious example is the ability interactions. Like, the first thing I saw from that, I think, was a druid showcase from a while ago. Or recently, they've also shown all of these other classes that have a million interactions with so many different abilities, and most of the time they don't even have support gems on them yet, or giga unique items that enable that stuff. I think a great example of that is the warrior that they've shown recently, which, like, with all of the slams and the fissures and the totems triggering slams and the slams then triggering the fissures, and then the fissures doing something else. Every class seems to have insane ability interactions, which really incentivize the player to use multiple, if not your entire keybinds for abilities, right? And then in combination with the WASD movement and the dodge roll, all of a sudden the combat becomes very, very dynamic. And I think multiple playthroughs of the same acts, even in the early access where we only have 3 twice, right? Even that might be fine, because the combat is so diverse, depending on which class you play, depending on, I guess, none of the gems are really tied to the classes unless it's the ascendancy ones, but still, like, every playthrough will feel very, very different, not only from an aesthetic standpoint, but also from an input standpoint. Now, that has happened before to some extent in Path of Exile or in Last Epoch as well, but I think Path of Exile 2 is going like 10 steps further in that regard. And as an MMO player, this reminds me of MMO combat. So I'm really looking forward to that. Like, a lot of people also said the combat looks a little bit like Lost Ark in a way. And I honestly kind of agree. Like, especially on the monk, I could see that. For me, that is a big, big, big plus, and that changes like my entire mindset about ARPGs. And the second thing that is usually a problem in ARPGs, and especially is a problem in Path of Exile 1, is approachability or accessibility. Now, I'm actually a big proponent of not sacrificing your game's complexity for accessibility, but I'm a big proponent of you should have both. You should have a game that is kind of intuitive to learn, but at the same time is insane depth for thousands of hours. And that is exactly what I think Path of Exile is trying to do anyways. There's like a million examples of this, but I'll just go through a couple that I find personally really, really nice. So the most obvious one is probably the gem system. That the gem system is way more straightforward. They're not tied to your armor anymore. Getting more sockets on the gems and all of that is way more straightforward, so new players can jump in, don't feel as confused about how this even works. You can still replace your armors, you can replace your equipment, and everything feels intuitive in that regard. I love that. I think it's a great change, and it elevates the entire game from an accessibility standpoint from the get-go. Like, the very first moment you log in, this will already have a massive effect. Same goes for the potions. Only having 2 potions now will drastically improve not only your hands, but the overall gameplay experience, I think, as well. Super good change, especially also in combination with the charms, which basically act like the defenses on the older potions. So essentially, you can get immune to a freeze, you know, every now and then when you have this charm equipped. which is great. The entire map looks better. That also goes for the Atlas, but that's more endgame related. The weapon swapping thing, where depending on which ability you use, you can basically assign a different weapon to it. I also heard it snapshots, which also is really nice. Big thing, and that is something as someone like me that really enjoys making builds, although I'm an idiot, is having a more approachable way of refunding points on your tree, which is with gold this time around, instead of having a currency item that you need to find or have to trade for. Which also brings me to the point, you don't have to trade currency with bots anymore, and even if you do, it will be way more straightforward and way less annoying. A big problem of mine was I usually played Trade League when I played, because I'm terrible at the game, clearly. So I used trading a lot, and it was really frustrating to trade for currency items, and that seems to also be addressed. I also really like the remake of the unique items, and that they're overall more useful in endgame and maybe even more impactful. The entire Ascendancy stuff seems to be way more fleshed out this time around. It almost reminds me a little bit of MMO classes in a way. I mean, just looking at the Chronomats, for example, that is such an impactful ability that you can also put gems into, by the way. That really reminds me of having more distinct classes while keeping all of the complexity and the variety open. Or the transformation of the Infernalist, for example. Or is that Infernalist? Infernist? I don't know. And just to list a couple more, crafting seems to be more approachable. No more cringe logout macro stuff, which is probably one of the biggest reasons why I never wanted to play hardcore. So I might try that and die a lot. I think bosses having static difficulty is absolutely amazing. It allows for a lot more clear goals where you're going, and also understanding the difficulty of the encounter you're in, because there's no random mods and stuff. So I also find that super interesting. I think I saw an Empyrean video about this. I will link it in the description, by the way. The tooltips in the game, every single attribute, every single thing that exists in the game can simply be clicked on and looked up. Like, as a scrub like me, that is such a big game changer that I don't have to go through 15 different pages of wikis and 13 different guides to understand a stat. Like, that is... I honestly, I'm surprised that it didn't exist in Path of Exile 1. Like, if just that change alone would make Path of Exile 1 way more approachable too. And honestly, the biggest thing for me is, it seems like the people working on it, and I've always said that about GGG, I just could never get into it that much, is that the people working on it actually play the game. And they kind of understand the problems. It's something that I always complain about in other games. That companies don't seem to understand what the game's shortcomings are and what the game's strengths are. But I feel like GGG knows that very well, because they actually play their game, and they're probably pretty good at it too. That in combination with, which I hope that will not change, by the way, because I think just as of recording this, there has been the console version was downloadable or something. I hope no one data mines anything. I hope no one knows anything. I really enjoy the idea of basically most people going into this game blind, and having even the most professional PoE players only have a surface level knowledge about the game. I'm a big fan of that, and it makes the entire game feel way fresher as a community. Like, if you go into a game and you just look it up on YouTube, and there's 15 different content creators that have already 13 different guides in detail how everything works, I hate that shit, man. Get it out. So far it looks like no one has any clue. I see a lot of tier lists and build guides or some dumb shit. There's obviously going to be content creators that are going to abuse this shit, but at the same time, I think no one really knows anything, and I really like that. And that makes me a lot more motivated to learn the game as well, because I can learn it alongside everyone else, if that makes sense. If you try to learn Path of Exile 1 today, you will be, I don't know, decades behind on the learning curve, which doesn't feel good for a new player, or a returning player for that matter. So all in all, I think the game is going in a great direction, and I hope they keep going in that direction of keeping it accessible and intuitive while maintaining an insanely complex endgame where you can have millions of different builds. And that's, yeah, that's exactly where I think they're going. And I'm looking forward to it. I will make a full review, you know, a couple 100 hours in maybe, and we'll see if my opinion has changed. But so far, there's very little things that I can complain about, which is rare for me. And yeah, I hope I see you guys in the game as well. Only like a week to go, so I'm really excited. And yeah, thank you for tuning in. Thanks for hanging out. And I guess I see you in Rayclast. Peace.